Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ProgCast. I'm Gregg Bendian, your host, where we really get into some ideas and some concepts, some different areas of the music world, of the artistic domain. And today is no exception. In the past, I've had some wonderful conversations with our guest today, and he is widely recognized as an important figure in theater and opera, and one of the most important figures to me in that area. I think of him as a visual musician, an artist, and my friend, great human being, director and conceptualist. I'm happy to welcome Peter Sellars. Hi, Peter.
Greg, that's awesome. My God. I think I should be doing your introduction. That's incredible.
Well, I'm so happy to.
Everyone, this is my friend Greg, who's just a total wild polymath who's receiving incredible communications from all over the universe at multiple levels constantly, and who just pours it out in the kindest and most generous way.
Wow. I think we should just stop there.
Okay.
Oh,
Greg, it's
Peter.
great to see you. It's great to see you. I mean, we can't say it's the end of the pandemic, but it's a late point at a sort of moment of breathing for a moment before we go through whatever the next round is. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've tried to remain productive, and we've tried to stay positive, right? So every time I talk to you, I feel very positive and very motivated, inspired. So today it's great to see you and to chat.
Yeah, and again, what's so great about, everybody suddenly turning to Zoom and whatever, it's just that suddenly we can be in contact in ways that don't involve, hotels and plane flights and so on, and just keep conversations going, which is, and Zoom doesn't do everything well, just like any human being.
Mhm.
But it does a few things pretty well, and it actually just makes talking to each other a pleasure and not a big stress.
I kind of like seeing the face of the person I'm talking to.
Yes, well, I mean, you're old school, but no, it's the vibe thing that, obviously is just the cool thing is to be in somebody's aura. And, we really haven't totally found the technology to recognize how auras work and how auras unfold and expand and change the space and change the whole emotional temperature. And that's what's great about actually being in the same place together.
Yeah, bringing people together and being able to have a real conversation about ideas. And I have so many things that I want to speak with you about today. Um, I did want to tell the audience that in 2014, you were a recipient of the Polar Music Prize for innovation in music. And I'd like to read what they said when they gave you this award, because I think it's quite interesting and a good jumping off point. Peter Sellars shows us that classical music is not about dusty sheet music and metronomic precision, but that classical music, with its violent power and complexity, has fundamentally always been and will continue to be a way of reflecting and depicting the world.
Wow. I think that's my first time hearing that.
Did you
Okay.
not go to the ceremony?
No, I was there, but we talked about other stuff, so that's cool.
I mean, how do you feel
You know,
about that?
well, what was really interesting was there, as always, those Nobel committees in Sweden are just interesting people who have dinner together and talk about things and talk about, stuff. And that year, the people on the panel were really focused on human rights. And so they were trying to, say, well, how does music respond to human rights? So they were really inviting me there to just deal with human rights as a musical imperative. And what does it mean that music has stood for human rights from early days, and that it has a function that's not just decorative, but that is truly emblematic of what we hope we care about, and people who have been disappeared, or who are being held in ways that we can't communicate. And how do you put something out into the air, into the world, into the vibration that recognizes justice and that is actually itself the presence of justice? Uh, and that's one thing music does really, really powerfully, is call for justice. So anyway, that was my Sweden, and but it's also one of these amazing times, because when we learned, obviously, in the pandemic, that the one of the points of the pandemic was the call for equal justice and equal access, equal, that people's lives have equal value and equal, those lives matter. And to hear that in the middle of a pandemic and realize that the pandemic itself was speaking about justice to a human race that has difficulty hearing, that's really deep. And so I think the justice movements that are underway in the last year are really, really crucial. And that's where music itself, again, can move past a kind of entertainment or distraction function and into a function of creating focus, creating intention, creating resolve, creating commitment, creating collective sense of empowerment and urgency. And and so in that sense, it's really a privilege to work with music at this moment in history.
I have to say, music really kicked in at the right time when this shit went down, you know?
Yes.
Not surprisingly, maybe, but I just thought, wow, music's there for me again.
Yeah. 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 I'm I'm just coming back from Paris, of all things. I've been here at home for the whole year, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, Macron opened up the theaters last month, and things that were postponed indefinitely or canceled. Suddenly people said, no, no, come over right now, come over right now. So I found myself getting on a plane, which was the last thing I imagined, and to go conduct a workshop of amazing work, which is a 14th century manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and it's the called the Roman de Fauvel, and it was probably made around 1320, and it has 5,000 lines of verse and 200 illuminated images and 168 pieces of music. And it was created in the 1310s by 25-year-olds, all of whom were coming radicalized out of the University of Paris and entering official service at the court, in the conciergerie and stuff, and just disgusted with the corruption and the injustice and the unbelievable financial dealings, and the expulsion of the Jews. It's not. It's the era of the accursed kings, les rois maudits. But to have a young generation, the opening motet is says the world is ruined. Integrity was something known to previous generations, not to us. Now, normally, that's the kind of thing that old people say.
Hmm.
And what's incredible is exactly like at this moment, it is actually what young people are saying. is we're entering a world that has already been ruined. We're entering a world where the integrity is long gone. And this manuscript opens with that motet and then continues. And it also, the folks making it, because it's a big collective thing. It's a samizdat manuscript. Nobody could distribute it because it's attacking the king and the whole administration. So it only exists as one thing. So they didn't print parts, and so everybody who's singing the motet has to gather around a single manuscript, which we did a few Saturdays ago in the reading room of the Bibliothèque Nationale. And of course, 3 of the singers are reading upside down, and it's pretty wild. But at any piece of music, people thought, oh no, this would be good, let's put that in. Oh, if you're going to put that in, let's put this in. And then, of course, a super brilliant young composer, Philippe de Vitry, created these avant-garde motets, which are 3 different lines of material, 3 different texts, all sung simultaneously with equal urgency. So you get the total chaos of what it means to be alive right now. And you're listening to one and then suddenly the other takes over, and you're listening to them all simultaneously, and one isn't in the background. They're all happening in the foreground. And of course, it's music for the eye, not for the ear. It's music that a community of people gathered around that manuscript are discussing everything in it. And so it's not about a finished performance. It's about the community building of all of us creating this simultaneous reality and acknowledging it together and discussing how this intersects with that, and this is on top of that. And these things are inextricable. And that's super powerful. But meanwhile, they're also recycling music from a century before that people really looked up to, the École de Notre Dame, the kind of great era of Philippe Le Chancelier. And so they take, a couple of the greats from a century ago, and they redo them in contemporary terms. And of course, the great lay, which is, 14-minute, which for medieval music, 14-minute piece is like, a Bruckner or Mahler symphony. And the title of it, Veritas Equitas. It's about truth and equality. And it's sung at the top of people's lungs. And it has this incredible power. And it is what 25-year-olds in 1310 were putting forward. So this manuscript is not designed for a performance. It's not, so you can't, perform it. But we've created a version that moves through it. And it is super radical. And it is totally focused on equality. It is totally focused on environmental activism. It's entirely against a corrupt financial system. And it's entirely about women's rights. One amazing section is 12 Elekine. And Elekine is French for the Erlkönig, the elk king, of mythology. These women come out of the forest, out of the woods, and there's a 25-minute sequence where 13 women discuss how they've been deeply hurt in love, searching for an equal relationship, and instead having lifelong damage. And both discussing subtle microaggressions and real violence, and the whole range of what you were hoping for from love and what in fact did not occur. And it's a pretty astounding work. I should just say that Fauvel, it's called Roman de Fauvel. Fauvel is a horse, centaur, some kind of four-legged beast that is the King of France and is running everything. And all the courtiers, the church, the financial people, everybody are stroking his hair and combing his pelt and brushing his tail and his mane. And that, of course, is where we get the expression in English to curry favor, because they're all trying to get stuff from him, flattering him, and as they brush him, whispering in his ear. And he decides that he wants to marry, have as his queen Fortuna, who holds the whole wheel of fortune. And she says, "Get out of here! Don't touch me! Don't come near me! Shut up! I am not interested in you. Yes, you're up here, but that's just because my dad, who's God, and I can really see what kind of person someone is by how they behave when they have power and money. Mm. And so we're just looking at you. Believe me, next stop is going to be down there." And that's also where you can tell what somebody's really made of, when they have no power and no money. And that's all that's happening. So get real. And the and her takedown goes way beyond the New York Times editorial page. It's really shocking. And she says, "But if you need to marry someone, Vainglory is available." And so there's a giant wedding of Fauvel and Vainglory, and we've invited the world's our version invites the world's 657 billionaires to attend the wedding, with all of their wedding feast, with all of their dietary needs catered for, and simultaneously the wedding entertainment. And that's what's shocking, are the Hellequins of 13 women showing up, talking about when love is not love. And then everybody in Paris hears this incredible celestial music. And the text says, every single person in Paris looks up into the sky, and a ladder is coming down to the Ile de la Cité in the middle of Paris, to the top of the building, and angels are going up and down. And they're singing this incredible chant of Daughters of Jerusalem. And the angels have come to prepare the virtues for a giant joust with the vices. And so after the wedding, there's a full-out grand battle with armor and horses and lances between the virtues and the vices. And the virtues finally kind of win, but everybody's bloody, muddy, and they're busy trying to tear the vices out of their armor. It's a mess. And there are these incredible motets that feel like both January 6th and the aftermath, which are this, raucous, simultaneous, apocalyptic sense of, futurist and past, crazy jumble of madness and rage. And then the after the battle, where you're just covered in mud, and winning doesn't feel good, because actually to win over these people is not the point, because they're your community, they're your family. And so you win, as always, military victory is really empty and just sets up the next round of violence. And the motet about walking the street all night and feeling lost after you've quote unquote won is very intense. And then there's a further motet, which is after you finish looking at your feet, look up and you see that incredible medieval image, cosmic image of the perfection of the universe. And the universe bends towards justice. And Philippe de Vitry, because there was no way to show change of rhythm in musical notation, so he made all the notes that are in 2, he printed in red ink. And all the notes that are in 3 are in black ink. And that's what's giving you these different trajectories of the planets. And in three parts, moving simultaneously. And a motet giving you this image of cosmic simultaneity, syncopation, and perfection. And then you turn the page, and there's a giant fountain. Guess what? It's the fountain of youth, and it's formed by gargoyles barfing into a big bowl, and all of the vices are licking their wounds, and they jump into the fountain of youth and take a bath, and they reemerge young and magnificent again with perfect skin like Jared Kushner. They're ready to attack the next generation. Anyway, it's an incredible manuscript. And so that's what I've been working on the last few weeks. And
I have so many questions, though.
Kind of awesome. And I didn't see that coming. It just kind of just arrived.
Wow. So in the 1300s, would this have had an impact on society?
Well, it's 1300s, 1320, everything's in a pretty horrifying state. And, the actual scandals of the time and the public executions, the drawing and quartering, it was grotesque, and it ripped through the whole society. And of course, the financial collapse was very real. And then everything was followed in the 30s by the plague. And so this was a serious takedown of an entire civilization. And these were the last, this was the last gasp. And by about 1350, 1360, there were about 70 copies of this manuscript that were circulating. So it actually moved samizdat style. It moved underground. And, it probably could be acknowledged in some official locations, but mostly not. But it did have this amazing underground life. And of course, by the end of the century, with the Avignon popes and everything, the 14th century avant-garde really took off. So the 14th century is this avant-garde century for music. It's this, and it starts with this social revolt of these 25-year-olds in 1310, 1320. And by the end of the century, it's just a whole new world of what music sounds like and how music behaves.
And so how was this presented while you were there? Just in an enclosed workshop, or how was it working?
Well, what was beautiful was we made a decision a couple years ago, and it turned out to be really the right one, I think, to have no instruments and to just make the evening a cappella, and to invite 7 women to sing it. No men's voices, because, I wanted to take away Mr. Trump's Twitter account. And so I didn't want to hear him. I wanted to meet him only through the eyes of the women. And then wildly, I mean, to hear these really deep, intense concerted pieces sung by 7 women has this, just the sheer sound cuts through the air and really goes right through your body. It's unbelievably visceral, and the kind of sustained intensity. And what's great is these women have advanced degrees in medieval music. And so what's cool is, you look at the page and there are like 14 notes. And you think, what? And then that turns into a 14-minute piece of music. And it really is, and Ben Bagby of Sequentia is the music director. And of course, I have no idea how to read this music, how to read this notation. And by the time Ben is done, it's like John Coltrane does My Favorite Things. It's like it turns into a 14-minute piece of music. It has nothing to do with Julie Andrews. and and my favorite things is morphed into this incredible cosmic vision. And that's what these seven women can do with Ben, is that somebody takes the fifth, somebody does the bourdon, everybody's doing something, and then suddenly you get this unbelievable explosion of rich sound and vibrating at all these levels, and consonances and dissonances, and it's just overwhelming. And by the time you get to a motet like Garrett Gallus, which Ben Ben Bagby calls the Beethoven's Ninth of the 14th century. I mean, it is just colossal. It is immense. And again, we're so used to thinking in, as they say, global terms, globalized universe. But, excuse me, these people are thinking cosmically. Your act, everything is a cosmic vision. Everything has a cosmic vision of moral truth, of spiritual clarity, and of course, like medieval art, super refreshing. Part of the manuscript is pornographic street music, like crazy street cries. There's one amazing motet which is "Fuck no, I am not gonna touch Favel's ass crack, even for all his money and all his gold." Okay, so that's the basic line moving underneath. That's the tenor line of the motet, and the other two lines are hymns to the Virgin. So you're getting this amazing social range and wealth and depth, but it's also like people protesting outside the Federal Reserve, or outside a police station, or outside Exxon headquarters, and protesting loud and clear. And then the cops start, arresting people and handcuffing them and putting them into vans, and that's when the prayers to the Virgin begin really intensely. And then you're in the world of all the singing pouring out of the Birmingham jail. You're in the world of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers carrying the altar of the Virgin of Guadalupe on their protest marches. And so that kind of phenomenal intensity of meaning and of purpose and of spiritual clarity in a time of unspeakable materialism and corruption, it's pretty overwhelming.
And says a lot to us today.
Well, what's super cool is the kind of, again, we're into this, oh, that's my opinion, that's your opinion. This cosmic frame is pretty phenomenal. And the other thing that's really beautiful is it's not a work written by from a single viewpoint, because it's created by a collective of people. You've got all kinds of tones and textures and points of view and energies, all alive in one manuscript. And again, that's even without even talking about the visual stuff, without even talking about the poetry. So we've invited Alice Goodman, who wrote Nixon in China and The Death of Klinghoffer libretti. And Alice is writing the connecting texts between the pieces of music, and making sure that they're not locked in 1310, but they're completely discussing what's going on at this moment. And so that will create, I think, the correct amount of immediacy and frisson. And she's wicked, and she's hilarious, and she is absolutely devastating. And so that will that will be very powerful. And then these 7 women putting this music forward with just full. And I think what's so, great about a cappella is, I mean, medieval music is beautiful, but already with the instrumentation, we go to a miniaturized place. And this manuscript is the single largest manuscript from the whole 14th century in the Bibliothèque Nationale. It's immense, and these are young people with a huge vision. So the a cappella suddenly allows the immensity and scope of a single human being to be overwhelming, and then a small collective can change the world.
And what do we know of the individuals that created this
Not one thing.
at all?
Well, I mean, yeah, Philippe de Vitry became very celebrated as a composer and as a ultimately as a cleric and political figure. But so yes, his name is left. But of course, nothing in this manuscript is signed by anybody, and we only know later because there are copies of that music, and it's identified with him. And again, we can trace the music that they're recycling from earlier eras, the Philippe Le Chancelier stuff. But most of it's anonymous, and most of it is again this sense of people working together, which is very, very exhilarating.
I have to say that your interface with French culture is something that fascinates me. Because there's a few instances I wanted to bring up with you while I have you today. One is your work with Jean-Luc Godard.
Wow.
Okay. And take your pick, but the other is the final Messiaen, which is the St. Francis.
Wow, Gregg.
And they're both big figures for me. I mean, Godard and the French New Wave and the French cinema, tremendous for me. Also, I'm just a huge Olivier Messiaen guy, and everything he does is of interest to me. But I was not as familiar with the St. Francis piece. And then I caught some of your version with Esapeka, which is on YouTube, folks, by the way, the St. Francis opera, which I guess my first question is, and there are so many, but my first question is, was Maestro still around when this was going to be put together? Because I know it's in 92 at the end of his life.
It was a very intense time, and he was fragile, and I only met him once. We were taken to his apartment and in Paris, and his apartment was already a fantastic cosmic space with every room had super crazy intergalactic wallpaper from the 50s. And it was like just these planets whirling by and stars, and it was like, but it was also perfect French 50s stuff. And 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 of course his wife was completely taking care of everything and solving everything and so on and so on. But I was really there just to get his permission to do the piece, because when he was essentially he's one of those figures who's ultra radical and ultra conservative at the same time, and his Catholicism was extremely conservative, and his musical writing was extremely radical. And so he felt, in the original production, which was such a mess, was he insisted that everybody reproduce the Giotto pictures of St. Francis, the murals, on the stage of the Paris Opera, which of course just created a giant, ugly, stupid piece of kitsch. And you know, because that's not a work of art, it's a copy of a work of art. It's a piece of kitsch. And so, anyway, that was tedious. And this was kind of the next major production of it. And so, 20
Did
years
you
later,
see the original?
no, I did not. I heard a lot about it because I had friends who were there, but I have to say, and there's a recording of it, so you can kind of hear it, but it's hard to take. And but everybody's being obedient, and so there's very little inspiration in the air, and it's heavy, it's heavy, and so I of course intended to not do something with the Giotto images at all. And so it was a very tense, and I was using a lot of video, and so I wanted to explain video to him, which he couldn't understand and couldn't imagine because they didn't have a television. So so that was a real. After a while, I gave up trying to explain video art, and I really just said to him, you know, because I tried to connect it to stained glass. I said, you know, so much of your music is about, you know, the way light comes through color, and that the light is moving, you know, just as the weather is moving and it's through stained glass, and light and dark and all these different gradations and movements are occurring all the time. I said, well, video's like that with these pixels. No, no, that did not work. but but I finally just said to him, you know, in one sentence, I said, cher maître, you're telling this 13th century story, um, 14th century, okay, just off a little bit, um, but you're not using music of the 13th century to tell it.
Quite.
So why should we tell it with images of the 13th century? And so he was quiet for a while. And then he said, vous avez raison. And I could leave the building. But that was the kind of breakthrough moment where he realized that, of course, he was using music that was completely contemporary to tell the story, and to express these spiritual truths, and to resonate in the environmental power and immediacy of St. Francis's life work. And so he got that. He really did get that. And then we went away to start working, and he passed away. And so what was meant to be quite celebratory turned out to be a bit also a sad occasion. And his wife was really devastated. And she was at all the rehearsals, or the later ones, but really emotionally, deeply uh, hurt and in mourning. I mean, she was not really able to follow, and she had a lot of difficulty with what we did. She really couldn't stand it, but it's also because she was still in mourning for him, and his passing was too recent. And so there was that was the souffrance that was definitely in the room. Um, and But Seiji Ozawa had conducted the world premiere in Paris, and he was the music director of the Boston Symphony, where I was living in Boston, and he came back and did 3 of the tableaus in concert with the Boston Symphony and with members of the original cast. And hearing that music in concert, you know, played by the Boston Symphony, was just staggering. And so it became, you know, on the list of things I have to do before we all have to do before we die. So that was really how that connection got made. And you know, now it's a piece that, you know, it's hard to live with because it's 6 hours long, and you have to be there because I think Messiaen's music doesn't respond well to recording. It's exactly one of those things where the sheer impact of the sound, the physical impact of the sound, has to be like you're in the presence of a mountain. And a mountain on video is nothing. Like a video, a mountain is this big, whereas a real mountain is its own real scale. And Messiaen's music, you need the 200 people making it to feel the physical impact and energy of that music. And it can't come out of two speakers. It can't, it has to actually vibrate the room, and you also have to feel the difficulty of playing it. You need to actually realize that people are holding themselves to superhuman standards in order to realize a Messiaen score. And so the spiritual aura and intensity is that we're all here together in the presence of something superhuman, and that we're all being tested to the limits of our skill and our endurance. And that's what makes Messiaen's music overwhelming and unforgettable. And even when it's a work for solo organ and you can't even see the person laboring, just these sheer, just shattering amounts of sound in a super acoustically resonant space, creates this time outside of time and space outside of space. And so in our period of, the art of the possible, Messiaen is the art of the impossible. Messiaen is the art of this will tax you. This is beyond what you can absorb. And because, in fact, the most important things in life are beyond what you can absorb or endure. And so that scope and scale is so crucial. And the Salzburg Festival is one of the only places that had the means to put together, something that could match his incredible magnificence of vision and immersive space in the Felsenreitschule at the Salzburg Festival, which is literally the side of the mountain. And so you're facing the rock wall of the mountain itself. And we could open the roof, and there were trees in the sky and birds. And you could really be in the presence of Messiaen's scale and Messiaen's urgency of a rock being a rock, and meanwhile growing things growing.
Do you know his Grand Canyon piece?
Oh God, yes. Yes.
So this is a man in love with the immense wonder of nature.
Yes, and I'm hoping in the next few years to undertake the piece he wrote just before St. Francis, which is basically the same orchestration, but it's about 4 hours shorter, called The Transfiguration. But it's that same mountain music where Jesus takes, a few disciples, Peter and James and John, up into a mountain. And at the top of the mountain, there's weather and light and incredible light. And then suddenly there's Elijah and there's Moses with Jesus. And you get suddenly all of time across centuries and millennia are suddenly only exist in the present on top of this mountain. And the disciples are blinded and they can't even look. The light is so overwhelming. And they look away, they look down, and then they look up again, and it's just Jesus standing there saying, I think we should go down now. And as they climb back down the mountain, he says, please don't tell anyone what you saw. Messiaen wrote this kind of about a 2-hour piece just of that, with this shattering music of the mountain, the light, the wind, of course, the birds. of that day where all of time arrived in a single blazing moment. So I'm working on that.
That's something I look forward to. Peter, you more than almost any other artist that I can think of has proven time and time again to me something that I strongly believe, which is that the great art exists outside of its time. So it has its moment in its genesis. It has the cultural, the societal connections, but the greatest pieces are pieces of vision that will take perhaps hundreds of years for us to really take some sort of hold of. And even then, it's tenuous. But I again, going back to the dusty sheet music, it's just, you step outside of that. And we all, I think the best of us attempt to do that. You step away, you step outside after you've been completely immersed, because I know you, because I'm looking at that room behind you with all that material that you've immersed yourself in. But then it's a response, and it's a big picture. And that's really what I love about your work.
Well, it's an incredible privilege. I mean, basically, most composers, died thinking they had failed because most of their work was not really heard in their lifetime and not heard the way they heard it. And again, it's one of the reasons to paraphrase what you just said, why I can't stand, kind of period productions, because Mozart was doing everything he could to escape the 18th century. And so to make him go back to the 18th century is cruel. Most of these composers were, like Bach was writing for a future. He was not writing about this week. He's saying, no, we have to make a future. This is about how do you make a future. And so most of this music is articulating a future. And of course, therefore, was either incomprehensible or a threat to people who were alive at the time. And I think it's just so crazy that after the first time out with the Matthew Passion, basically Bach spent the rest of his life writing for people who are not yet born, and said, I'm not going to fuss with the people who are around right now. And I'm going to write music and put it on the shelf, and one day the people who need it will find it. And so much of the history of music is about, something that could not be realized in the composer's lifetime. It's a thrill to be able to be part of the future that these folks were trying to reach. And
Varese comes to mind when you mention that.
Well, and again, what you always want to do is say, okay, what was not available to them that they were looking for? What can we do that they were hoping for? What can actually? And one of the things I feel really strongly about is censorship, because most artists in most centuries, in most locations, have written under very, very intense conditions of censorship. And right now, I mean, I was going to say that about, most of our lifetime in America. That's not mostly been the case, but of course we're moving back into that realm where you have to watch what you say, and think who's going to listen and who's going to get it and who's not going to get it and how it's going to be used. So censorship is now coming back in our age of total surveillance, and a random thing you said, that's suddenly out there on the internet is like shows up as some spore of evil. And so one just has to really nonetheless say we can speak about things that most people were not able to speak about when they were creating these works. And so it's our duty to articulate these things in a way that the original creators couldn't. Meanwhile, the other side of it is they can say things that we don't dare say. So it's actually quite interesting because it works in both directions. and it's really powerful to have your ancestors comment on your behavior. So it's like, oh, right. I didn't think of that.
Well,
So that's powerful. Yeah.
and it's funny because you in a way you're saying, oh, I'm not saying that, they said that.
Yeah, and I think it was, God knows, most artists used deliberately set what they were doing in the past so that they could again just say, no, this isn't me, I'm just talking about what it was like in Spain,
Mm.
150 years ago, which is Mozart's thing with Don Giovanni or Moliere's thing with Don Juan. And so Spain became the location of the kind of strange film noir that people were trying to work on. But the other thing that I think you really you've got to recognize is that these pieces have waited a long time to speak, and so you want to give them everything you can, and and again, not deal with how they were received or perceived when they were new, but because that is very limited. But you want to say, okay, what was so beyond the time that they appeared in, and can we meet them there?
What were they trying to say to us? Can we say that now? Can we bring that forward? Can we progress to this level that they were pointing to?
And so many things, are at a certain moment are inconceivable, like reparations. And the day is going to come when reparations are not inconceivable. They're actually with us. And where a lot of the truly evil stuff that is accepted and taken for granted will one day be unthinkable. And you say, can you believe people did that? And so, again, it's important to push against what is at the moment unthinkable
Mm.
and to think it and to actually make the gestures towards enacting it. And if that's reparations, if that's a larger understanding of wellness and moving beyond a kind of materialistic sense of medicine. I mean, what's very exciting right now, is social medicine is now finally a movement. Narrative medicine is a movement, and you realize, right, medicine, wellness is a story, and illness is a story, and it's how you tell that story to yourself and others, and what is the story of what we're struggling with. That's really, really crucial. And so it's not just a vaccine. I mean, yes, it's a vaccine. Thank God for the vaccines. But the vaccine is not the whole story. What is the story of what we're struggling with? That has to be told. And that's really interesting because, we are so bad at articulating what we're really going through right now.
Mm.
The press can't do it. The politicians can't do it. Nobody is able to put their finger on the depth of loss, on the scope. And one of the other things I've been working on a lot is Heinrich Schütz, who, as you probably know, is a young musician, went to Venice and was one of Gabrielli's students, and was there for those incredible blasts of brass and choirs in St. Mark's Cathedral, and like had his ears ringing, and went back to Germany, said, we have to do this stuff. And he wrote these incredible, the Psalms of David. These early pieces are just explosions of multiple choruses, multiple instrumental groups, these incredible polyphony and outer space music, all this stuff. And then, he worked at a level no German musician before or after worked. And then 30 years of war. And then the plague. And Schutz spent the second half of his life writing for continuo, 3 musicians max and 1 or 2 singers. And as an 80-year-old man, he wrote these passions, the Matthew Passion, the Luke Passion, the John Passion, for 4 performers.
Mm.
I mean, because he had to learn with the budget cuts. He had to learn with the fact that you're in a war, that the people you wanted in your chorus are dead, and the plague has taken the rest of them. And suddenly you have to do all of this spectacular stuff with just the handful of survivors. And earlier this year, I lost my dad in January, not to COVID, but just he was in Phoenix, I was in Los Angeles. We were in the 2 COVID hotspots. We couldn't go near each other. I couldn't see him. I couldn't talk to him. It was like a whole thing. And right now we have literally hundreds of thousands of people all around the world who didn't say goodbye. There were no ceremonies. There were no exchanges. And so, what is the art that we're going to make to say farewell? What is the art we're going to make that acknowledges the scope of the loss and the weight of it and the feeling of it once we've let the Novocaine wear off? And we don't use these deaths for something, but we actually realize the deaths are a much bigger affliction. And so one of the things that I'm a bit obsessed with is in the 30 Years' War and in the middle of the plague, there was a local official in Dresden who was a musician and was in Schutz's little choruses. And he knew he was dying, and he commissioned a sculptor to carve for him a coffin out of copper and painted with gold and black, and he chose a series of passages about death, and it's really, they're like, there's one that goes above the face, there's another that goes by the feet, there's another that's placed by the hands, all on this coffin. And then he commissioned Schutz to write a piece for the funeral that had these same texts. And Schutz produced the first German requiem using these texts. And it's called Musikalische Exequien, which is basically means a musical exit. And what does it mean to have exit music in this world? And anyway, just to say, the first part of the piece is like 25 minutes long, and it's all these people stepping forward like a community, each stepping forward with a line or two. Sometimes it's a single voice or 2 voices or 3 or 4. And then sometimes it's a small group. Sometimes it's just, it feels like a random memorial service where people are just impromptu stepping forward. At the same time, it's a German requiem. Meanwhile, then there's the funeral oration, and after the oration, the next piece is a motet in 2 parts. So one half of the community is on one side of the coffin, and the other half is on the other side, and they're going back and forth over the body of the person who's left, and the conversation is moving over them like a bridge and reaching across. And then the third piece, which is truly mind-blowing, is Schutz stations groups of women, each surrounding a baritone, out across the different spaces in the church, up into the loft, and then outside the building. And he has the group left around the coffin continue to sing. And then he has, not even in polyphony, it's this crazy, mystical music from outer space that you're just kind of hearing. And the sound of these women's voices leading a baritone starts to move outside the coffin, outside the church, across the church, up into the loft, and then outside the building. And you feel the spirit of the dead has been lifted and removed from the building, removed from the coffin, removed from this body, and the spirit has been translated. And you're in the presence of this sonic experience that's other voices while the main group is singing. There are other voices and other presences in the room. So I'm working on that.
Peter, I'm so sorry to hear about your dad.
No, it all worked out. I mean, in the sense that, you know, it was time and he chose it. But it was just one of those things of you know, I was in a fairly modest situation. But of course, it makes you think of the people who were not, and for whom this was not by choice. But this was a nightmare. And a nightmare of no touching, not even being in the room, not even seeing, not even holding somebody's hand. So I think our generation of artists has a lot to work on right now.
There's no telling what's going to happen in terms of artistic expression as a result of what we've been through. And I think of my own work and even how it's changed a little bit already in terms of urgency, in terms of focus, in terms of importance, if that's not too vain a word, but just sort of, you know, what do you want to say?
Necessity and usefulness. I think those are the two things that, you know, I really try and keep in mind is what is needed, what is necessary, and what is useful. And can we be a lot more useful right now? And the short answer is yes. And what is necessary is a pretty impressive and serious list of what is necessary right now.
You know, you mentioned Mozart earlier, and it's interesting to me that you worked on a production of his unfinished opera, the fragments that he left behind around 1780. He was working on something called Das Serail.
Oh my God! Well, that you mean Zaid,
Zaid.
which became Zaid? Yeah, yeah. Well, always with Mozart, you know, the finished and the unfinished is a little mysterious in a lot of Mozart, and because yeah, and you know it when you're making new things yourself. You know, you barely get something on, and you think, "Oh my God, what else could this be? What else could this have been?" And so the question is really with Mozart. He started writing this piece called Zaid, which essentially is his anti-slavery work. And it's very directly in touch with anti-slavery movements. And it's set among a group of slaves. And it's one slave speaking to another. And then there are two of them who are a movement. And then they speak to a third. And there are three of them that are a movement. And then they bring someone else along, and there are four. And literally the piece goes from solo arias to duets to trios to the famous quartet that ends it. And that's Mozart's first breakthrough quartet. What does it mean that four people are singing? And what it means for Mozart and what he used quartets to do. And Greg, you've stopped me if we've talked about this before, but you know, it is my obsession, which is the Haydn and Mozart were not just musicians, but they were in the Masonic movement, which was the democratic liberation movement in Europe. And
Fascinating.
so Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and so on were all members. And Mozart, in the last year of his life, wrote two pieces for glass harmonica, the instrument invented by Benjamin Franklin. So, I mean, this is what they were connected. And so they have Thomas Jefferson saying all people are created equal. And they see the example of the American Revolution, 1776, and the 1780s. These people are in Europe are still stuck. How come we haven't done this yet? How come we still have our damn kings and queens? How come we haven't made this move? And so the Freemasons movement in the Vienna area, of course, had incredible intellectuals. These were the intellectuals that were going to create the first democracies in Europe. And two composers were in the room. And you have this expression of all people are created equal. How can you prove that? You can't. You absolutely cannot give evidence of that. And Haydn and Mozart took that on as an artistic challenge, which I think is one of the important things we do as artists, is how can you demonstrate something that nobody yet has seen? It's a reality that we know is true, but we haven't seen it. And the two of them basically invented the string quartet. And we said, okay, we're going to show equality and what it means that four lines are equal, that if one person leaves, the whole structure collapses, that it requires conversation, it requires everybody being attentive to everybody else, it requires a sense of incipient harmony and mutual interest, and all of the complicated things that a string quartet actually requires. And then Mozart, way before Haydn, said, okay, now that's nice for stringed instruments. I want to talk about human beings. And so with Zaid, he made the three slaves who were trying to escape sing in a quartet with their slave master. And suddenly that quality of equal attention, that everybody has to pay attention to everyone else, that something has to be shared or it will break, was this revolutionary moment in abolitionism. And then Mozart in Idomeneo made it fathers and children and men and women singing as equals, each having to listen to each other and respond in kind, and frequently ending up singing the same music because that is the music. And then he moved it further, obviously, to Figaro and Don Giovanni and these visionary quartets, which were all about how people who want to kill each other actually need each other deeply and are the solution to each other's healing. Anyway, that's a little digression, but just to say,
very interesting.
That's what I was working on in Zaid. And so I was obsessed with it. And Mozart was, of course, he's 23. So when you're 23, you're super angry and furious with everyone. And you can't believe how corrupt the official systems are. And you want to be a radical. And you are radical. And so this piece, Zaid, is quite amazing. He was also writing simultaneously the stage music to something called Thamos, King of Egypt, which was again the same way that we have all the Egyptian symbols on the U.S. $1 bill. This Egyptian revival in the 18th century was again about imagining another system of government, another system of spiritual illumination that could go inside real enlightenment, an enlightened government. And so I put that piece is also kind of a bunch of fragments. So I put the two pieces together to make one finished piece. And that music is super wild. It is just wild. And then Mozart was planning to move to Vienna, and everybody, all his friends said, excuse me, if you're going to bring that stuff to Vienna, it will never work. You need to make a comedy. And
That's what
that's the
happened.
story of what happens the next round with Mozart. Put the rage aside. The rage is not going to get you anywhere.
Wow, Peter, a couple more things, please. Can we talk about your film with Godard, King Lear, 1987?
Oh my
Talk
God.
about multiple voices. I mean, you're layering layer upon layer of voices and meaning and just putting the audience out there to fend for themselves. And I love that. I mean, I remember attending a lecture by Steve Reich when I was a student. And he talked about Charles Ives and a couple of other things. I think even William Carlos Williams. And he said, when I don't get it, that's not the composer's problem. That's my problem. I need to get it. I need to figure out how to get it. I need to do the work to engage, to connect. And I sat with your King Lear for a while, and I should tell our listeners, Burgess Meredith is in it, one of my all-time favorite actors. Woody Allen is in this film, among other people. You are acting as the son, the great, great, great grandson of Shakespeare in it.
And Molly Ringwald is incredible.
And Molly Ringwald's in it. So what was it like working with Godard on that?
Oh my God. Well, there are lots and lots of stories, of course, but just to say, when I was a freshman in college, I was in the wrong class and I transferred midway in the term into a seminar that was taught by the same professor, Alfred Gazzetti, a beautiful, beautiful filmmaker, which took Vivre sa vie, a Godard film from, I think, 1966, and spent 15 weeks looking frame by frame at one movie. And every music choice, every literary choice, every image choice, researching all of it. So you could source all of it. You could see every piece of source material that created this film. To look at a single work of art in that kind of detail was just, of course, mind-blowing and opened my whole life. But also to see inside of Jean-Luc Godard's unbelievably difficult choices. Just why he, of course, as always in life, made the difficult choice. Because the easy choice is not going to get you there. And the difficult choice is usually what life is asking you to make. And you rarely want to make it. And some artists make the difficult choice. And that would be Jean-Luc. And so, of course, I memorized his works and just became obsessed with them. And then, ironically, some years later, Tom Letty, who was producing these kind of middle late period Godard movies, had signed up. It's the famous deal signed on a cocktail napkin in a bar in Cannes that Jean-Luc said, "I will make for $1 million King Lear," with Norman Mailer as King Lear, his daughter as the daughters, and to a screenplay written by Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer wrote a kind of screenplay of a mafia thing, you know. And Godard flew Norman Mailer to Switzerland, and they did one take of one scene, and Mailer left the set and quit, or Godard fired him, who knows what, and they went home. And suddenly Tom Letty had a movie that needed to be made. And I knew King Lear inside and out because I spent a lot of my life working on King Lear in lots of contexts. I did my own last production at Harvard was King Lear, and very intense, and I ended up playing Lear in a crazy way. And then I was really obsessed with Kozintsev's great film of Lear that was, you know, with the soundtrack by Shostakovich and the translation of Lear by Pasternak. That is one of the great films ever made. I knew that film pretty inside out as well. So I actually then met Jean-Luc the morning he was shooting Woolly Island. and
Ah,
he said, "Come to the shoot," and and he didn't know what he should be doing, so he he decided it would be two sonnets, and he said, "You go explain these to him." And Woody said, "What is this? What does this mean? Why am I saying this?" Jean-Luc was gone. I was the only person left. It was crazy. uh, and um, and that's pretty much how a lot of the shooting went with King Lear. He fired Burgess and Molly about the third day of shooting, and said, "Get rid of the actors." But again, with never talking to them once, just said, "You go talk to them." And so it was very intense. And meanwhile, in order to get some more of King Lear into the film, I flew back that week to New York to work with David Warlow and with Malachek, and we read lines from King Lear that I thought would be good to have in the movie. And so those voiceovers that you're hearing all through are those two great actors, whose Shakespeare is just incredible. Meanwhile, the actual shooting with Jean-Luc was completely wild and always unexpected, and you never knew what was going to happen. And he flew us there to France on the Concorde when that still existed, and then we sat in an airport hotel for 3 days.
what?
And there was still no script. Uh, and then we arrived. Everything was, it maximum last minute improvisation and just in his head. And then once he got rid of everybody, I stuck around and we started to think together. Every day he would write incredible things and say, "Well, how would you do that in English?" And my English is crude, trying to get what his French is so precise and you know and very French. So so that film became a very intense film that was made in the edit, which you can feel, and is very so it becomes a kind of, appropriately for King Lear, a very lonely, intense work by someone who's quite misanthropic in the King Lear sense, and who is impatient with everyone. And of course, to be with Jean-Luc, it's one of the greatest experiences of my life. But I barely opened my mouth for the time I was with him because he's so daunting. He's simply the most intelligent person you will ever meet in your life. And his light, the intensity from his eyes is blazing at full, full power every moment. And anything you say is just witheringly stupid. And he just looks at you like, what? And meanwhile, the next thing he says is staggeringly profound. And so you're with somebody who's so most of our time nobody dared to speak because he was just, Jean-Luc was silent, and then he would. But there's so many lessons in my life from that film, and that film is, of course, one of the great films ever made, because most people are making a kind of work of kitsch. They're imitating what they think Shakespeare should be. Godard refuses to say what how do we imitate Shakespeare. Godard just took those themes and discovered them on his own terms, and with incredible courage and incredible intensity and clarity of vision. And I mean, he photographed Molly Ringwald so beautifully, you just kind of can't believe it. And of course, then to put Virginia Woolf's The Waves into King Lear, of course, well, like, yes. And to really actually let Shakespeare literally move across the centuries was just so beautiful and liberating and visionary. And of course, to say that if it's Shakespeare, it's all about sound. And so liberating the soundtrack, I think that's one of the great movies where, for me all my life, Jean-Luc's great example that I used in opera all the time was liberate the soundtrack from the image track. Stop having this master-slave relationship and let it be a conversation. Let them be two intelligent beings. And the soundtrack is saying this and the image track is saying that, but it's a conversation. It's not like they're not in lockstep.
And counterpoint.
And there's total counterpoint in there. Disagreements, but the disagreements are illuminating. And as all human disagreements are. And so don't just, act like everything's fine. Let everything be as complicated as it actually is. And so King Lear is just one of the most exhilarating movies because the soundtrack itself is a complete world. And you're looking at the images, but meanwhile, what's happening on the soundtrack? It's incredible. So all of which is just to say there's a lot of, it was one of the greatest times in my life of meeting him, working with him, and his quality of generosity to me, of course, as you see in the film, is very droll. It's very, very amusing. And at the same time, to say, okay, your character is going to be William Shakespeare Jr. the Fifth, which is like a super generous and an incredible put down, all at the same time. And it's very touching because, again, for me with Jean-Luc, he's a master portrait artist. And it's like, you're looking at Picasso after Picasso after Picasso. And he's making portraits. He's just making the most exquisite portraits of Mali. He's making incredible portraits of Burgess Meredith, for God's sake. And he's just, when he looks at people, he's really looking. And you see the intensity of the gaze, and he's seeing so much. That's very, very rare because a lot of films are made the way a lot of conversations are made. People never really looking at each other, looking past each other, or just looking at the general picture rather than really deep into somebody's eyes and saying, who are you? What are you doing? And Jean-Luc's beautiful way of looking was incredible. The other thing that I learned for my whole life from that film was we were constantly filming in incredibly photogenic places. And he never once looks at those places in the camera. Right. He's always, and I learned that, it stays with me my whole life, always point the camera away from the view. And he always points at something you would never look at. And he makes that the focus of the scene. And meanwhile, there's this incredible vision. We were always filming next to, the lake outside Geneva, and these incredible visions. Never looked at it. He really would point the camera at the ground, at that rock, and at somebody's shoe, whatever. And it would just, always with a kind of groundedness and humility. It was very, very powerful. And what a amazing artist in the history of art.
He's 90 now.
Yes, and there's a new film that I'm not allowed to talk about today, but we're showing it at Telluride, that has footage of him from this year. It's not his film. It's made by a brilliant young Iranian director, and he's given her incredible images. And he's in this film, which you would never guess. But it's, of course, a film about aging. And it's quite overwhelming. It starts as a kind of joke, and then the later phases of the film are unforgettable. And you see Jean-Luc in an amazing place of vulnerability, which you don't see often. And the film is unforgettable. So anyway, I'm not allowed to talk more about it now because the Telluride program has not been announced, but it's a kind of amazing masterpiece, and about the aging of a great monster.
And that Lear that you did with Godard was also towards the end of Burgess Meredith's life.
At the very end. That was basically his last performance.
Did you have any time with him? Any interesting interaction with him?
No, I mean there were, of course, there were so many of stories of his youth, but that I was obsessed with all the WPA, Orson Welles stuff, and all that. He did not want to go there, and he was, he was writing his his late years. So what he did was, of course, we were in Switzerland. Godard would choose not to talk to us for a few days, so Burgess would call up wealthy industrialists he knew in the area, and they'd take us out to 10-course meals. And you saw Burgess living the life of a great star and somebody who's a man of the world, who's been here, done that, done everything. So we saw much more of Burgess's kind of grand seigneur thing, and that's how we ate while Jean-Luc was working on the script.
How did it work out explaining Shakespeare to Woody Allen?
Well, I mean, you don't waste your time doing that. You stay as straightforward as possible, and I mean, explaining Shakespeare to anybody is, it has to be their Shakespeare. It can't be your Shakespeare.
Mm.
So it's less about explaining it and more about creating the space for them to exist in it. But no part of Woody Allen exists in Shakespeare. He doesn't really think that way, and he doesn't think of himself that way at all. And so it's a shoe that doesn't fit. And so that's what's in the film, is you get that it's a shoe that doesn't fit, and you get that it's awkward, and you get that it's some kind of mistake. And again, with Jean-Luc, you don't know who's doing what to whom all the time. Woody, of course, just wanting to be helpful, said, "Of course I'll appear in Jean-Luc's film," but had no idea what that meant. Nobody did until this crazy moment of that shoot. And Woody was available for those 2 hours, and so Jean-Luc shot something in the whatever floor of the Brill building
Mm.
was nearby. So everything was it was near the hotel. It was near, everything was near, and that's how Jean-Luc worked. Everything was near his home in Switzerland. Everything was making a film out of things that already kind of had your fingerprints on them. And so it's both an epic picture and totally intimate and private and a totally enclosed world.
You've spoken so much over the years about the state of cinema, and I wanted to ask you about two filmmakers of the American avant-garde in particular that I am quite fond of. One is Maya Deren, and the other is Stan Brakhage. Did you get into their stuff at all?
Well, I actually have a whole DVD of a bunch of Maya Deren films that I haven't seen yet, sitting right here. So Maya's coming up later this week. But obviously, the Haitian stuff, that's our future. Meanwhile, Stan, I only got to know very at the end, again, just before he left the world. But the Rotterdam Film Festival that I was a participant in for a number of years, did a complete retrospective. And Stan and I were in the same hotel, and we had breakfast every morning. And I went to all the screenings, and that was an amazing window into Stan, and with Stan, and that was exhilarating. So I got just an incredible Stan Brakhage immersion just before the end, and yeah, super thrilling, super thrilling. And again, images of what film can be, and film, is more like a Picasso painting than it is like a Hollywood movie. And, that idea that, it's a painting, and like a piece of music, you can't simply read it. It has a whole bunch of things in it that don't reduce. And that's exhilarating.
Do you have any favorites?
I have to say no, because they showed everything, so there were all kinds of crazy things happening. It was pretty exciting. I mean, the one there's an old Telluride story that I probably shouldn't tell, but Tarkovsky finally came to Telluride, and it was this incredible moment, and Stan was there that year, and so Stan took Tarkovsky into the hotel room and showed him, like, I forget which film. And Tarkovsky just looked at the screen and then looked at the floor the whole time and said, "This is, my eyes are hurting," and
Uh,
couldn't even look. Uh, so it's that thing of there are worlds and there are worlds and there are worlds, and what's so beautiful about film is there's so many worlds, and we tend to think film is one world, and or two or maybe three, but of course the beauty of film is that it is like music. It's pretty infinite.
it's almost like Tarkovsky was about static and stillness, and Stan was about movement.
Yeah, and I think Tchaikovsky was, you know, investigating the question of the nature of the soul. And Stan was way into life itself. And not about soul, but the meeting of the human and the non-human in a super powerful way. And allowing the human to be in the non-human and allowing the non-human to testify.
I met him once. I guess it was in the 80s. And I so wanted to do music for one of his films. And of course, that's not a big interest there, you know.
Right?
He did start to use a few things right towards the end, but I gave him a cassette and then I never heard from him. But I did do a piece in his memory, which was all, well, it was one layer of it was microphonic sounds. So all things that were just amplified to the nth degree that you would never be able to identify, which I thought connected with his way of seeing.
Oh
And
yes.
then I played live percussion while that tape of the microphonic stuff went on. And I haven't played it since the 80s, but I thought it worked quite well. And I never got a chance to play it for him. But that's the visual world heavily influencing the sounds.
Wow. Wow. Great, beautiful. That sounds beautiful.
Peter, I'm such a big fan of your work with John Adams. And there's such an amazing history there between the two of you. I I do have a favorite piece of yours the two of you did called Dr. Atomic. And I have a million questions, but I'll try to go easy on you.
No, no, go for it. I mean, go
Okay.
for it. That piece has a million questions.
It really does. Let me start just by opening up and saying to you that I'm a science geek. I find science to be fascinating. When I first realized that someone was treating Oppenheimer as a tragic figure, I thought, yeah, that's for me. That I know what that is. I've read about him. I feel it. I taste it. And so when you started to put that whole concept together, and I do want to know about the construction of the libretto, but just talk to me a little bit about Oppenheimer, because I don't think people realize just how he figures in, even into the pacifism movement, to the bigger questions of what science is in humanity, what it means. How did you land on that?
Well, just to say, I mean, this is a project that actually came knocking, which is so interesting. Uh, uh, Pamela Rosenberg, who was running the San Francisco Opera, wanted to do a season of Faust operas, and so she decided that Oppenheimer was Faust and was a Faustian bargain. And 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 so she called us together. We brought Alice Goodman to San Francisco to meet with her, and it was bizarre. I mean, clearly you could feel the theatricality of it. I've always resisted in a certain way, and I said to, when Steve Reich made the piece about bikini, for me, I always have a very strong feeling that some things art is not qualified to engage in, because art makes something dealable with and in some way decorative. And so for me, like, you could not have a convincing piece of work about the Holocaust. You can't say 6 million people had to die so we can have a second act. I'm sorry, it's beyond the pale. And certain things remain, as Samuel Beckett said, unspeakable. And for me, Hiroshima is one of those things that I never want to turn into an aesthetic event in any way. And I don't want to reduce to let it be graspable as an aesthetic event, because it should remain as something that is beyond the pale. And the and Alice Goodman said, "This is not a Faustian piece." And she said, "Robert Oppenheimer is not Faust. Faust signed away his eternal soul, and Robert Oppenheimer wasn't sure that he had one." Which was an incredible, incredible way of putting it. And we started working with Alice, and I did what I always do with Alice, which is do a lot of research, gather the research and send it to her, and mark certain things as this will be helpful, this will be interesting. And then Alice decided she didn't want to write this piece. And she stepped away from it. And the images of Oppenheimer and Teller, in kind of butting heads, two Jewish intellectuals in the middle of those years, was something she didn't want to enter. So I had been doing all this research, and I had all of the research at my fingertips. And it suddenly realized that it would make sense to do an actual documentary opera, in the sense that we have what people really said. And you don't have to make up something. You can actually, that is what they said. And some of the things are what they said in their memoirs, but a lot of other things are, from the Freedom of Information Act. We do have all the FBI files of the intercepted phone calls. And so we actually do know what people actually said. Meanwhile, I was working with John Else, the incredible, documentary filmmaker who made the great film The Day After Trinity, and interviewed all of that generation of atomic scientists before they died. And he put his files at my disposal. And he had transcripts of all of his interviews with them, and that was really incredible stuff. And then, of course, because it's a work of art, you don't want it just to be quote-unquote documentary, but you need it to be poetic. And it was really discovering the voice of Muriel Rukeyser that created a voice for the women and a voice of conscience in mid-century America, a female voice that both understood science very deeply and wrote about science with incredible grasp, but also knew that something was amiss and wrote about that, frankly. Meanwhile, of course, Oppenheimer was carrying in his pocket Baudelaire and the Bhagavad Gita, so that also gave two more poetic and cosmic voices that could give dimension to the whole piece. So John and I really set out, and I, sent John all this stuff, and John made, of course, incredible musical shapes out of it, and created kind of taut film scenes out of many parts of it, and of course, climaxing with one of the great settings, in John's life or anyone else's life, which is the John Donne "Batter My Heart," and so that was a really an incredible. The piece really took off, and John just poured himself into it and wrote some of his greatest music, and the as always, not as always, we knew the cast, and we really, one of the most difficult things was not really finding the right Kitty Oppenheimer for a little while. That was tricky, because when you cast someone before an opera exists, you don't know how the opera is going to emerge, and so that was a little elusive for a while. But the San Francisco Opera at that period gave us amazing rehearsal conditions, and we were able to rehearse very, very. We had two rehearsal periods, one in the summer when the opera was closed, so people could really be concentrated, and then another which was in the season leading into the premiere. So the piece, we the performers got to really live with it, and that was amazing. The orchestra, the chorus, everybody really lived with it, and then we had all these programs going. The physics department at UC Berkeley, the Exploratorium, of course, founded by Frank's brother, in San Francisco. All of these organizations participated in talks and in historical insights and reminiscences. So we had such a rich surround, because the topic was a Bay Area topic when we were premiering this, and there were amazing people to be in conversation with. And John was very deeply in conversation with the, physicists in Berkeley, one of whom played the clarinet. When the discussions went very far, and it was literally the right subject for the right place at the right time. And so the range of input that created an extremely rich soil was extraordinary for that piece. And of course, Pamela Rosenberg supported it to the hilt as a vision of her era of the San Francisco Opera. So then, of course, any piece that's complex, you have to just live with it. And we kept living with it, and we got it to Amsterdam, where we made a quite an amazing video of it. And then we got it to Chicago, where one more time we were knocking on the door of nuclear history, and the Fermi Labs people showed up. All of the key sites at the University of Chicago, and the people running those labs all came and participated. And meanwhile, with the Bhagavad Gita, we could talk to Wendy Doniger, and the great, the University of Chicago incredible department of Sanskrit studies and so on. I mean, we had such great people to discuss this piece with, and it was part of the history of Chicago. Another city where this was part of the nuclear history of the world. And we had major, at that point, there was we were negotiating the Iran nuclear agreements, and a number of major Nobel Prize winning physicists came forward to the Dr. Atomic gatherings and said, this was a mistake. All nuclear weapons have to be eliminated. All of them, not one can be left. And the world is at risk if there's even one. And so that was a really powerful history of the piece. And then we had one more huge step, which is the Santa Fe Opera decided they wanted to do it. I was always asking them if they would do it, but for years they said no. And then finally, in the last season of Charles' incredible years there, he wanted to have Dr. Atomic as his final season. In his final season, and he said to me, the most important thing for him is that Native Americans would be involved on stage and not be played by extras and not be, people in makeup acting like they were Indians. And Charles, of course, grew up in New Mexico, and he grew up knowing personally so many people in the Pueblos. So that commitment was very powerful, and that did shift the piece. And for the 3 years leading into the Santa Fe performances, for one thing, the set was already there in a certain way. So we made a new production. And of course, the casting of Julia Bullock as Mrs. Oppenheimer was a complete transformation of the piece. And a younger generation of singers took on these roles. And that was really, really interesting. Meanwhile, three pueblos, San Ildefonso, Santa Clara, and Tesuque Pueblo came together to create a ceremony that was danced on the stage of the Santa Fe Opera before the opera began. And then they danced the ceremony that was in Oppenheimer's dream in Act Two to the music of John Adams. There was actual sacred dancing, which is something I never dared put on stage. And the Pueblos decided, no, this is an important thing to do for the next generation as a gesture of peace. And of course, the dancers they chose were kids, because they wanted to make the point about the future. Meanwhile, we got in touch with the Downwinders associations, and we had also on stage many, many people from a range of Downwinders associations who had lost family members for now 3 generations to thyroid cancer. And those people could be on stage with the singer playing General Groves as he said, we will not evacuate these nearby communities. And the results of that were there were witnesses on stage with the singer. And so we were actually staging New Mexico history in New Mexico, 8 miles from where it happened. So with participants whose lives were completely shaped and changed, we did a series of, for 3 years, meetings of scientists from Los Alamos, Indians from the Pueblos, and Downwinders, all meeting each other and telling stories, because most people didn't know the other groups. And to realize that this history is still hidden. This history, which was truly scripted for the movies after the fact. And most of this history remains this created history. So what it was to get inside that history, which of course is what John did with his music, and what Muriel Rukeyser was able to do. And, the line that's not in the opera, but it's one of my favorite lines of Muriel Rukeyser is, the world is not made of atoms. It is made of stories. So this piece came to life in Santa Fe in a completely new level. And it was this summer that we had these just shocking storms. And so the performances of Dr. Atomic were windswept with lightning everywhere. And it was incredibly dramatic. And the piece came to life in all these ways none of us could have imagined when we were making the premiere years before in San Francisco. So all of which is to say, the piece itself is very, very rich, but that's also because the loam that it's rooted in, it was so rich. And John Adams was just poured himself into nuclear history, but also, as I said, getting to know the scientists in Berkeley and debating all these points with them and going very, very deep into it. And as you know, John Donne is a formative voice in John Adams' life with harmonium. And so in many ways, it's just one of John's most powerful, sustained, and deeply integrated utterances of his entire body of work. You feel that all roads are leading to Dr. Atomic in very powerful ways. And so, and of course, as always, when you don't know how to do something, how do you stage or create music for the countdown to the first atomic explosion? I mean, what a challenge. And John went there.
It is one of the most impressive elements of the whole thing is your first time experience. You're saying, how are they going to do that? What's going to happen when we get to that moment? Not, and backing up a little bit, the fact that it's all the 24 hours before the test. I mean, it's the compact time, the compression of time only makes the thing more intense and more volatile. And I love that when you get there, you hear the Japanese woman's voice asking for a drink of water. It's devastating.
That is John's. I mean, John simply did that really spontaneously, and he really, it was not foreseen. And John, that was John's last gesture. That was John's last gesture, and really powerful. And you know, again, it's such a the 24-hour thing. I really said, okay, we're going to be classical about this, and this is Aristotelian. This is like Racine. This is like, you know, I need this sense of the stakes being that high,
Right.
as they are in Greek tragedy, as they are in Racinian drama, where the highest moral questions are in front of the human race. And there are 24 hours. There's a day and a night, and that is that is what holds the piece in a grip. And then it lets John do these strange meandering things also in the second act, you know, when, because John makes the first act just relentless, and then the second act, you know, in the middle at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., you just lose it, and things are drifting in and out, and you can't keep track, and you can't finish that thought, and, you know, all of the kind of delirium that takes over as well is so incredible when John is so unbelievably hard-headed in Act One of the score, and you know, and every moment is prepared and arrives on schedule. And then the second act, you just go, what happened? And and you're really in that space of reverie, which is you know, my friend Bill Viola always says, you know when you're an artist when you're falling, and you know you're falling, and you know you can't catch yourself. And that sense of the second act, where everybody knows it's all falling, and nobody knows how to stop it, how to catch yourself. And you can just feel that viscerally. I mean, John's music is just incredible.
Also, all the different voices that get to chime in about this impending, unbelievable moment, and the palpable fears, the suspense. I love that John references horror film music, you know, from the Cold War era of monster movies. That's another huge thing for me.
Well, and you know, John literally, the first word in John's, you know, when we spoke, was Varese. I mean, John really wanted to go for that, the sound of that era, which for him was Varese, was this music from outer space, the music from beyond, the music from the unthinkable. Was that Varese brought that texture to America, and then Hollywood went with it. But definitely Varese was on John's mind. And obviously the other thing in the body of the work is this, you know, the two reigning composers of the 40s from opposite sides of the musical spectrum were Stravinsky and Schoenberg. and they were enemies, arch enemies, and rivals. And John creates a score which is both has this Stravinskian relentless, symphony in three movements, relentless forward energy, and these dark, poisonous Schoenberg harmonies.
And I
And
also thought Symphony of Psalms.
oh yes, totally. No, exact. I mean, again, there is Stravinsky,
Yeah.
best of, and there's Schoenberg best of, and one is this, pellucid, focused, sharp, urgent thing, and the other is this magma that's just, melting down in front of your face. And so before your eyes, and so the two musical elements are fused to each other, and that's what's incredible, is John making those languages that were supposed to never the twain shall meet, and in that opera the twain meets.
Honorable mention. Now, I love Batter My Heart, Three Person God. Love it. Love it. But am I in your light?
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. When John said that, none of us could believe it. None of us could believe it. And of course, it's such a great poem from Muriel Rukeyser. Such a great poem. And John immediately humanizes the entire story. And it immediately becomes intimate. It immediately becomes flesh. It immediately becomes a marriage. It immediately becomes, all the things that human beings are most sensitive to and that can't even be articulated. And you're under the skin. You're in such places of sensitivity. And again, we all glaze over and become incredibly insensitive when we talk about the death of millions. And suddenly, when it's the person you're living with, and it's about which side of the bed you're on, and when you're turning the light out, suddenly everything gets incredibly sensitive, like, to this level of, nuclear, unbelievable nuclear sensitivity. The slightest move, the slightest twitch carries incredible, incredible repercussions. So, and John got to that delicate ticking thing that's between two people. It's such an amazing work that when John wrote that, we all just lost it. What a magical and perfect moment.
And it's such an amalgam, as you say, the Baudelaire and the Bhagavad Gita and these desperate elements that you would think, well, it's a hodgepodge, but they just web together so perfectly to tell the story from all of these different angles. And I guess that's what's so profound for me about it is you could have just made it about Oppenheimer, but it's not, because then there's Teller, and then there's the military personnel, and then there are the underlings who are being berated for, not giving the answers that they want, which is so familiar today.
Right. Right.
So.
No. I mean, it is. And again, what's incredible is, this material does exist. So, the Freedom of Information Act, has gotten us things that we were never supposed to know about and never supposed to see and certainly never supposed to hear. And so, again, those are now choruses set to music by John Adams is phenomenal. And you really are hearing the sound of history. And as you said, I mean, this, because it's John's music, it's the future. It is, I mean, all of John's pieces are quote unquote historic. I mean, it's one of the interesting things about John. I mean, most of this material is not set in the present day. Most of John's operas, Nixon in China is 1972. And they are period pieces in one way, but John's music is not. And that's really what's interesting is, yes, John evokes certain of the sonorities and certain of the gestures of the period, but in fact, the music is completely his, completely contemporary, and completely moving forward.
Yeah, it's an incredibly powerful piece. I wish that there could have been a video of the Santa Fe, but as you've told me in our previous conversations, there would be no way to really truly capture it.
You truly had to be there. I mean, it was you needed to feel the weather in your face. You needed to actually, be outdoors at night on one of those summer nights in New Mexico when it decides to storm, which is the drama of that second act, and the and and also it was, the set was just where we were, and a camera, you couldn't light the Sangre de Cristo Mountains so the camera could pick them up after dark. You had to know that we watched the sun go down, and we watched those mountains go into dark for the second act, and all those things that you and again the Native American ceremony is something, again, like we discussed with Messiaen. It's something that video can't begin to give you what presence is that's happening, and how a small gesture becomes something you remember your whole life.
And I want to tell our audience, but I really want to tell you, Peter, that when we started talking about Dr. Atomic, a summer storm just started in my neighborhood here in New Jersey. And maybe you can hear some of it in the background, but it's going on.
I see it. I see the trees rustling.
Right now.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Did you find Richard Feynman to be an interesting source for this stuff? I wondered why he wasn't ever really in this piece. Was it too many people? Because he was a fascinating source to me about what went on at Los Alamos.
I mean, he was such a lightning rod. He was so brilliant, but in a way, he's his own story. And so once we really knew that Oppenheimer was the through line, and Kitty Oppenheimer was the through line, and the foil, in a way, was the two foils were Edward Teller and General Groves, and that the young next generation scientists, Feynman just couldn't fit into any of those geometries, and so I mean, God knows the stories are incredible, and I mean, what a brilliant man! But truly, he is his own opera, no question.
Yeah. Just the way he negotiated, dealing with all the bureaucracy and all of the clever ways he had of dealing with things in that situation, just always blew me away.
No, let's put it this way, never in his life was he a supporting character. He was always the center of whatever was going on. So, we just have to respect that in this case. And really, again, to deal with who Oppenheimer was facing, the challenge was coming from his own graduate students and from the U.S. military, and then from the actual, future ultra Cold Warrior, Mr. Teller, and this question of there will be no limits. And so I think that those figures set the moral center, and show you what the decisions were that Oppenheimer was struggling with. I think that on that particular night, I mean, I think that Oppenheimer's issues with Feynman were in other realms, but that night Feynman was not really in the picture, and so, but yes, one day.
That's so great. I just want to open this door to get some air in here. Sorry.
Oh, sure.
You also have a recent piece with John Adams entitled Girls of the Golden West. And this is an interesting period, too, to be looking at, because the gold rush was only recently have I become, aware that this was an international event. The gold rush was not the story necessarily of just the American West, but an international event Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, it was literally in newspapers in Cairo, in St. Petersburg, in China, in India, in Brazil. So there were people coming to the Western United States, to California from everywhere. And so it was the world's first truly multicultural society, and that's quite amazing. And meanwhile, the press, certain aspects of the press are pretty much the same. That is to say, a lot of the articles about how to go to California and strike it rich were totally written from the imagination. Like, actually, that wasn't how you get there at all. And like, it was this kind of crazy journalism that, so of course, what people went through was beyond anything they ever dreamt of. So that was pretty wild. And of course, the tall tales didn't stop with those articles. As once everybody got to California, the tall tales kept coming. And that whole tradition of getting rich, what you tell people, what you don't tell people, and what you tell yourself and what you don't tell yourself. I mean, that's of course what that piece is about. And then the need, which we've experienced subsequently, to say we're competing with people for this money, for this gold, and the way we're going to take it all ourselves is going to be along racial lines. And we will actually make it clear what white supremacy means and who owns this place and what it means that Chileans and Brazilians will be driven off, Indians will be massacred, Italians and Australians will be in trouble, Chinese will be servants, all that stuff is and will be prostitutes. All of those racial lines were drawn incredibly quickly so that the money remained in white hands and not in black hands, although there were plenty of free slaves or escaped slaves who came west. There were black cowboys. There was an incredibly rich array of humanity. And so what it was that within 7 years, only white people had the money. And everyone else was disenfranchised and forced to work as indentured labor or some slaves or some kind of peonage. That's very intense. And it's the Supreme Court decisions that said that the first decision by the California Supreme Court announced that Chinese people were from the Negroid race, and therefore they were actually black people, therefore they had no rights, therefore they couldn't own land, therefore none of this gold was theirs. To watch the legal apparatus get put in place of white supremacy is quite shocking, and it's a very vivid picture, and it happened in a very short time. And of course, the white people were recent arrivals because the Spanish and the Mexicans had been there for at least a century. So even the official landowners were Spanish speaking. And again, all of them driven out. So it was a shocking image of white supremacy at that moment in history. And of course, with everybody on this get rich quick daydream, which is what our country has been through in this last generation. And you see the disastrous results, essentially. So that piece does go inside that violence and inside also the hope and the joy and some of the promise that so many people brought with them to the New World.
What was your vision for the visual, for the staging of that piece?
Well, in the production, we all, the design team, we all went to Calaveras State Park, where there's this just astonishing redwood stump. And this stump became very famous in California history. A bunch of miners, just for the hell of it, decided to chop down this redwood, and it took them a month. And at the end, it fell over, and there's this giant stump, and they danced on it. They held concerts and danced. And that stump became the beginning of Muir's movement, uh, uh, ecological movement, and said, can you believe they would sacrifice a California redwood, one of these trees that is older than humanity? And what do they do after they cut it down? They dance on it. Now, if that doesn't show you people are stupid, and that was the beginnings of the conservation movement, was that stump. So we decided to locate the second act on that stump. and and the sense that, obviously the linkages of the white supremacy movement, and obviously the hoarding of the money, and obviously the disenfranchising of people of color, all was also an ecological crisis. And so all of that is kind of in the main image that's going on, and is an image of the violence that's underpinning everything, and that's inside basic American structures, and that really is still unhealed, and it's in our generation we're trying to address.
And you also are able to turn it into a feminist story.
Well, what's great is because the women were so rare, so they had a certain type of power and a certain type of kind of visibility. They were unique, and of course Dame Shirley wrote these incredible letters to her sister, and they are articulate and sharp and absolutely acutely observed, and very funny and very dry and not moralizing, but just wise. And her tone of voice, John just fell in love with it. And John wrote many, many, many passages for her voice and for her gorgeous prose that are not in the opera because there was just too much. And ended up having to be trimmed. But I have to say, John just loved writing for her voice. And the fact that he was writing for Julia Bullock at the same time didn't hurt. And so John just wrote and wrote and wrote. And to hear John write this, you can hear the pleasure in John's musical writing. The pleasure, the instrumental voicings, you hear John in such a good mood. It's very beautiful.
So great. Do you guys have chats about other things you want to do together?
Well, John is embarked on a big project right now, and I'm not in there because I'm doing a whole bunch of other things, and so I'm sure when that's all over, we'll see where things are, but at the moment we're all working like crazy, so we will check in a little later.
Look forward to that.
Yeah.
It's a great team.
Well, I mean, it's a privilege to work with John because his depth of responsiveness and his discovery of a musical language for each opera, because I think it's really rare. I don't think there's another composer who you can say really found a different language for every opera.
Well, Nixon in China, Klinghoffer.
Right. I mean, there's the leap from Nixon in China to Klinghoffer is total. And then, how you arrive at Ceiling Sky, how you arrive at El Nino, how you arrive at The Flowering Tree. Each of these pieces, John finds a completely new musical world. And the tone and temperature and the sound world of each piece is so different. And I think that's truly astonishing. And that's John's, first of all, vast amount of incredible skill and musicality that, his John Adams' musical spectrum is so huge. He can go anywhere he wants to go. That's pretty astounding. And the range of voices and characters that he has written music for. If you look across that body of opera, it's unbelievable. So, yes, I think it's kind of an unmatched achievement in the history of opera that a composer has that kind of range.
I might say the same thing about you, Peter Sellars. The
Well,
range of interest, the grasp, the depth.
well, there's a lot to work on. And again, what's amazing is we have incredible friends. We have, there's opera is not a solitary art form. You get to work with people you admire in all kinds of ways, from all kinds of fields and backgrounds and histories and cultures. And so that's the joy of the art form, is that it's collaborative. And every group of collaborators brings also worlds and worlds into the process that you could not have imagined yourself. So,
And what are your thoughts on the state of opera today?
well, what's exciting is the state of opera is basically going to be small. COVID came to make sure of that. And I think what we're learning is a whole generation of composers are now writing small operas that fit in the palm of your hand, and that, you have 4 people and it's an opera. You have 6 people, it's an opera. You have 7 people, it's an opera. And the singers are playing instruments when they're not singing. And, it's this idea that opera once again can fit in the palm of your hand. I think we're all recovering from this gargantuan image of opera, which is this bloated, climax of the Age of Empire level of the biggest theater in town, the biggest orchestra, the biggest chorus, the biggest everything. And it's such a joy to be back with Monteverdi, and to actually, be hanging out with, okay, 10 interesting people. Well, 4 interesting people that then becomes 10 interesting people. And you have Orfeo. This incredible, just intimate process that opera is and that can be. And in the case of Monteverdi, in the case of Bach, in the case of Handel, this idea that a handful of people can create an opera, that's just thrilling. And that it's not just about size. It's really about everything else. And for so long, opera had to take the biggest bite out of the arts budget. And so in this age where we're looking for equity, in this age where we're looking for, shared sense of equality across art forms, across communities, across human histories, opera was taking more than its share of the available arts budget. And I think it's appropriate that opera is now moving back into a more modest relationship and again into a more collaborative place. And I think that's just fantastic and very, very exciting.
I'm very excited about the upcoming Wayne Shorter opera. He's doing a sci-fi opera.
Again, I'm hearing all kinds of things, from, whispers backstage. It seems incredible. It just seems incredible. And of course, the folks that are working on it, what an incredible group of people. So let's see where it goes.
Esperanza Spalding.
Can't do better. That's starting at the top.
And sci-fi too.
Yeah, all of it. It's just all good. So let's just, yes, all wind to their sails. Like just totally.
Peter, I could go on and on.
Oh, well, Greg, we will. We have long lives and we're going to keep going. But it's so great to see you today, and compare notes and catch up, and obviously we'll do this again soon.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Always looking for more stuff from you.
Well, again, just bless you for being there and being there with everything that you're alert to and sensitive to and feeling and recognizing. Is like, thank you, really, thank you. Just and more to come.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for
Have a
listening.
beautiful evening.
I hope so. It's still torrential rain out there. Maybe it will make it.
When you live in California, where we're in the 9th year of a drought, any time it rains is a blessing. You're simply only grateful for rain. That's the best thing that could happen. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
Let it pour. Good night. Lots and lots of love.
Lots of love.